What's up, guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. I want to talk about really big aquariums. I think most people that get into this hobby have some aspiration to eventually have a really big tank. I'm talking 500 gallons plus, some absolute showstopper. I'd like to talk about some of the problems that can kind of arise from a big tank, because I think for the most part, the idea of a big tank oftentimes is a lot better than the reality of actually having one. Okay, so the very first thing about big reef tanks is that they're often quite a lot deeper top to bottom than your standard tank. Most of them are going to be 24 inches or deeper, and that doesn't seem like a big problem, but basically every inch past 24 inches is going to be a lot more difficult to take care of. Some of these tanks, they're not just like 28 inches deep, they're like 36. Sometimes they're 48 inches deep. And that is going to have other problems that we'll talk about later. But just in terms of maintenance and the logistics of working in and around that tank is going to be extremely challenging. If you don't believe me, try putting just a tape measure to 36 inches. Put that to your aquarium stand and see where that puts the top of the glass. You'll notice pretty quick, unless you're an NBA center, you're not going to be able to reach the bottom of that tank in any way, shape, or form. So that's the first thing. It's just the maintenance aspect of a very, very, very large, deep tank. So you might be thinking, maybe I'll just stay at 24 inches. And you can, but you may or may not be happy with the appearance of that tank. These bigger tanks, for example, I've got a couple of tanks that are 10.5 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 24 inches tall. They look very shallow just because of the geometry of that tank. When you have a 600 gallon tank and you're limiting that height, that means it's got to go long, it's got to go wide. And when you do that, it just has this almost like this frag tank type geometric appearance. Aesthetically, it would look a whole lot better if it was deeper than 24 inches, like the 30, 33, 35, 36 inches. It would look really good if it was 48. But again, at that point, you would be going from something that you may be able to get your arm into to basically needing a wetsuit. At 48 inches, you're snorkeling. Okay, the next little drawback to a big aquarium that people don't necessarily realize is that you do want that big front to back distance. Like I said, on one of my systems, it's about 4 feet. I've seen systems that go back 13 feet. It's really good in a sense for the workings of the aquarium. It gives the fish a lot more room to swim around. It's got a lot of surface area for gas exchange, all good things. But visually, all of that front to back distance is practically wasted, or worse yet, is a downside. So let me explain. Water visually compresses. So when you look at something that in an aquarium that's like 4 to 6 feet deep, front to back, it looks like that stuff that's towards the back of that tank is 12 inches from your face. It's just this optical illusion that happens in water. Stuff that's far away looks like it's very close. You really don't get a great sense of the size of the tank. It just looks like a regular tank. And only when you start to look from the side angle that you realize that, oh, this side panel could be its own separate show tank. And not just its own separate show tank, but a gigantic show tank at that. Even on peninsula tanks that are, like in my case, 10 feet long, if you're looking from that narrow face all the way back 10 feet, it doesn't look like it's that far away. It's 10 feet and it doesn't look like anything really. The other problem that introduces is when it comes to observing corals, the best way to observe corals is either going to be top down or it's going to be something that's relatively close to the glass. And when you have a tank that is so large, pretty much everything is going to be set way back into the tank. And just the turbidity of the water, it casts this haze over all of your viewing. If you've ever been to like a public aquarium, it's cool that there's like these big aquariums and stuff there, but if you're really being critical about it, it's not the best viewing experience compared to a home aquarium. There's a lot of like smaller home aquariums that simply just look a lot more crisp, and it is because you have this water depth issue where the water itself introduces that haze appearance. Next topic, catching fish. Very difficult. The worst case scenario is, let's say you have a nice large 500, 600, 700 gallon tank, and you notice that one of your fish is sick. And not only is it sick, it's getting other fish sick. So you now have a tank that you need to start catching stuff out of. And it's fully aquascaped, there's corals all over the place, and you have to get these fish out, or else those sick fish are going to kill all the healthy fish in this tank over the course of the next couple months. Not a fun task at all. I've done it. Me and the guys with individual nets, you just have to kind of hope and pray that you get lucky. Okay. The next logistical challenge with large aquariums is that it's harder to design water flow in them. You need more pumps pointed in more directions. When I first conceptualized my SPS show tank, I was really hoping to avoid having a lot more of these extra pumps around. So I designed a system of closed loops in addition to our main return. There's a total of 4 Ecotech Vectra L2s on these closed loops. There's multiple directions that you can face those guys through the plumbing mechanisms with lock line and stuff. And we were getting a lot of flow from our return pump. And still, in this acro system, we still needed a lot more, to the tune of about 6 more power heads. So we ended up using some Seche Voyager 10s, which are some very, very strong pumps, as well as some AI Nero 5s. It worked out for us, but I was kind of surprised by just how many more pumps that we needed. And it's not good enough just to get a few big pumps. You need to have a lot of different pumps just to, again, introduce spot-specific flow. So that's one aspect that sometimes people might underestimate in a large aquarium. Okay, moving on. In the really big tanks, those 36 to 48 inch deep aquariums, now you're running into engineering challenges because all of that water puts an incredible amount of force on your side panels and your seams. So your tank is literally orders of magnitude less safe than a smaller aquarium. Pretty much the tanks that break are these really big, deep tanks. My rule of thumb is to overbuild these things like crazy. So I'm talking about armored seams, I'm talking about heavy Euro bracing, pretty much 3/4 inch to 1 inch glass is going to have to be standard, if not going with acrylic from the beginning. Even though I'm not a big fan of acrylic, once you start into the really big stuff, you're going to be wanting to go with acrylic. I would say that the maximum size tank that I would ever even consider for a glass aquarium is going to be about 1,000 gallons. After 1,000 gallons, there had better be great engineering behind that because it's a huge risk at that point. And that's why when you see like giant shark tanks and stuff like that, it's all acrylic. Last thing that I'll mention about these big tanks is that sometimes, coral especially, sometimes these corals do better in smaller tanks. There is an aspect of husbandry that by making husbandry tasks easier, they get done more frequently and better. For example, I noticed that some of our corals in quarantine, which are about 60 gallons, they do better in quarantine than they do once they get into our farming setups, which are closer to 300 or more gallons. I think a lot of that has to do with just how much we kind of dote on these corals in the smaller tanks. And once they get into the bigger tanks, a lot of it becomes a lot more generalized, like broadcast feeding and things like that. Whereas a lot of like the really up close and personal types of spot feeding tends to happen more in the smaller tanks. Stuff like that. Perhaps also the concentration of food is going to be heavier in the smaller tanks compared to the bigger tanks that might be more diffused. But you might notice that type of thing because I can already tell that a lot of like the Micromusa lords, for example, they were as big a polyp as I've ever seen in quarantine. And then once we got them into the bigger tanks, they're still great looking, but there's a difference. So that pretty much does it for this video. I still think that Aquarists should strive for as large a tank as possible, especially when it comes to fish. I don't like seeing a lot of fish in aquariums that are too small. So in that sense, like a bigger aquarium, the bigger you go for it. But these are just some considerations that people may or may not think about when scaling up to this dream tank, these 500,000 gallon or more tanks. A lot of times, the idea of a big tank is a lot nicer than the reality of actually owning one. So that's all from here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Happy reefing.